Okay, we'll call the meeting to order. I have adoption of the minutes. June 23rd, July 2nd, July 16th, and September 8th. If anybody wants to move those as a block, that would be good. Second. Any errors or omissions? Okay, all those in favor? Opposed? And that is carried. Thank you. So adoption of the agenda. Any discussion? Okay, all those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. Thank you. Prior to this evening's meeting, the board did hold an in-camera meeting where we discussed property matters. Okay, go down to chair's report. I do have a small report to make this evening. Just wanted to take an opportunity to talk about the relationship that's been established primarily between the superintendent and the board since we were elected. 9 months ago, it was very clear to us that our superintendent was taking a lot of flack from the public for decisions that were made by the past board. Let me say it again, that it was our superintendent that was taking flack for decisions that he did not make. So that's pretty much unfair, I think, to our superintendent. So superintendent and senior staff, they're supposed to be trusted advisors to the Board of Education. They are not supposed to be flak jackets for the Board of Education. And our board views our superintendent and our senior staff as trusted advisors to us. We've worked hard to establish positive, respectful ways of working together that not only benefit the work of our board, but also benefit the communities we serve, and most importantly, our students. We are working very well together, I think, and this included our work together on the grade structure report we released last week. 9 months ago, it was clear to us that the community was dissatisfied with how decisions were made by the past board. It was also clear to us that we could not attempt to build community consensus about how to move a divided district forward by quietly telling our superintendent what the 7 of us thought and then having him write a report for us to vote on. So we decided to do something kind of bold. We decided to actually keep our campaign promises and take this important issue to the community. Along the way, we invited some members of our partner groups to sit on a board committee to develop some options for the board and for the community to consider about grade structure. And any person that sat on that committee should be able to see their work clearly reflected in the final report we released last week, and recognize that the basis for that report came directly from the collaboration of members from the District Parents Advisory Council, the CDTA, the Comox Valley Principals and Vice Principals Association, our support staff, the French Advisory Committee, the Aboriginal Education Council, and district staff. Dr. Tinney, working with the board and senior staff, took that committee's options and constructed the final report that will be used for public consultation. Every one of our partner groups were involved in the creation of that report, and so it truly is a district report. It is now time for us to take our report to the community and ask them what they think about the options we've created. The board is open to hearing what the public has to say, and we really look forward to the upcoming consultation. And we do enjoy our work with our senior staff, and we are glad that they are here to work with us. So thank you for all you do, all of you sitting over there. That being said, we'll move on to management reports. Dr. Tinney.
We see an information item, proposed schedule change to Brooklyn Lago Schools on page 3 with a briefing note written by Paul Berry, and the board has seen this before, and just looking for final approval.
Move to approve.
Second. Any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. Thank you. Next item over to you, Lynn.
Thank you, Chair. I do have 3 items to go through. They are fairly lengthy. I will try and be as brief as I can. If I do go overboard, though, you feel free to give me the stop sign anytime. The first one is a fairly brief one about the capital reserve being used for AFG and energy projects. If you remember, at the last meeting, we did actually ask the board to approve in principle some projects, and we thought they would come back in a 5-year plan. The ministry is actually rethinking how they're going to actually approve those projects. And at this time, I really don't know exactly what that process will look like. So it's kind of have to take a wait and see. I may have to bring it back as the 5-year capital projects, and I may not. So anyway, that's just to bring you up to speed where we are in that one. Okay, on the next one, which was requested by the board, the capital funds and uses on page 8. I've gone through and tried to sort of give some background about each type of funding as it comes available and sort of a feel for what its uses are. So, and the first thing I need to do is throw like a summary of what's available. So the restricted capital reserve there that show at 5.9 million, actually almost close to 6 million, that is the net figure after I've adjusted out for those other projects that we talked about that would have been normally AFG projects, so it is reduced. That figure, if you look at the financial statements, you can see it is $8,088,000, but I have taken out those projects that are sort of at least approved in principle. So what's left at this time is that 6 million figure. In the local capital, we have just a little over 2 million, so 2,131,000 there. And that's the amounts we have to play with. I'll mention at the end again that the AFG, of course, was not funded at all, so it really doesn't fit, or I would have had that in there as well. So restricted capital, so that comes to us from 2 different ways. If we sell a property that was funded by the provincial government, then we have to take some of that money at least into the restricted capital. Now normally it's a 75-25 split. If it's an older property, there were some that were 50-50, but it's generally runs at that 75-25. Now the other way we can end up with funds in this restricted capital is if we have a capital project that's approved, the way the laws actually work right now around funding those projects, we're responsible for both overages and we get to keep if there's any under, right? So in a couple of instances, being the seismic projects at Rob Road and Highland, we came in significantly under budget. So that money is actually in that restricted capital fund for that amount. So that's about $5 million. Typically, the ministry has been saying to us, and I haven't heard a change in this, is that could only be used for seismic in their mind. But I've also heard some little rumblings of people that have only that kind of funding left there, and they're being allowed to use it for AFG, possibly. So it's just, it's something that could change. So to use this reserve, we normally, as I mentioned, have to change our capital plan. That means we have to do up there some paperwork that Blair Pettis, our Director of Capital Projects and Planning, does, and then we submit that to the ministry. And then once it's actually on the 5-year plan, then we can ask for it to be approved. We can also revise our 5-year capital plans. That's what I was referring to being brought before the board, would be as if there's a change in priorities or a change in what the projects are, we'd have to bring that to the board would pass, and then we could send that to the ministry and hopefully they would approve. So that's, in a nutshell, is restricted capital. Both of these are limited to the capital nature items, right? So bigger things that have a life beyond the 1 year. Restricted, I think, has a bit of a higher level, both because the ministry has to give us approval, and just two, I think their expectations are that it's much more connected to the buildings. It's not those other sort of equipment kind of items. Local capital, which is the other funding that we have, when I mentioned the $2 million figure, this arises out of sales of property or equipment, where the board has paid for it all out of their own operating funds. Older properties are almost always fully paid for by the school district, because there was a time when the city and the province didn't really get involved. So they were local referendum almost, and it was passed, and then the money was raised locally, so it gets to stay locally. There has been some changes over the years. That did go to 50-50, and then in the early 70s, I believe by then it was 100% the ministry. But again, if we sell some property that fits that category of locally raised, that money gets to go in there. This use is at the discretion of the board. Again, only it has to be capital in nature, but a little bit lower, level, sort of in terms of they will consider things like computers and, smaller items that would sometimes not get capitalized just because they're not a lot of money. Again, the board has complete discretion on that. So the other interesting piece in local capital relates to the fact of how you can use it, because in our operating budget, because local capital money, which used to be a separate category of funding from the ministry, they actually have a category there where you can spend your money that's actually from the operating. I'm saying this wrong, let me rephrase that. In our operating, we spend some funds that are actually capital in nature, so we could actually reverse that, spend our local capital on those items that are in operating budget and using those local capital funds, and therefore that relieves the operating budget of those expenditures. So to the extent that we have those types of expenditures, which now is about $400,000 a year, we could actually take that money in that little lumps of $400,000 and move it from local capital to operating, basically, if that makes sense. So we do have a couple other items that have been reserved in the past out of local capital. We do have an agreement around the track out by the rec center by Vanier. We did have plans at some point to resurface that track, and I think, and I haven't actually talked in a while, it was about $70,000 or $80,000 in total. We'd have to come up with half of that. So I'm thinking we probably need, $50,000 or something from the local capital to cover that. There is the $100,000 for the maintenance building that we had put in before, but I'm thinking, given if we get the money with the other projects that we asked, like the ones from restricted capital, we'd probably remove that one and put that back into just being available. The only thing I could add is, we haven't had any directions from the board since we have stopped the Lake Trail and Brooklyn issues. So, at some point here, after the board makes some further decisions, we would look for that guidance at that time. So, I did put down some recommendations here, but they weren't really recommendations that I think for being passed. It was just some of my thoughts on kind of what we could use the funds for. But of course the board can choose to do whatever it likes. The local capital, I think, given that we can support our operating budgets, and as you see later tonight when I do the financial statement, there's probably a good need to reserve that for that use. So I think to the level that we can use the local capital for operating budget, we probably should. The restricted capital, as reduced amount shown for those projects we talked about at the last meeting, I think the balance, which isn't a lot more than the $5 million that we brought in from those other two seismic projects, is that we then consider taking that funds in our hand to the ministry and see if we can raise some of the projects that are on the 5-year plan. That, of course, with the number one is Vanier at this time. As I mentioned, the annual facilities grant is zero, so really not much to talk about with that one. Sure, happy to take some questions.
The Vanier track, have we changed the agreement with the regional district? It used to be each of us having to budget $25,000 a year set aside for future resurfacing.
Well, yeah, I believe it was not 25,000, but 5,000, because that's what I remember. I could be wrong. It's been quite a while since the agreement. But what I was going by was they were talking about it in the paper just a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about only needing $70,000 for it. Now, they may have only been talking about their half. That's the only thing I kind of worried about.
Because I think the last time it was resurfaced, it was significantly more than $70,000 to resurface it.
When we had the AFG eliminated, was there anything that was emergent on there? Because we've been receiving a lot of letters from other districts that are in the same boat as us and have gone to the ministry stating that, you've said under emergent situations you will fund these, whether or not they will.
If I could, it's true they are considering emergent funding, but what they've said is if you have capital reserves, we'll let you use it, and if you don't have capital reserves, we'll let you borrow it. And this goes back to how they used to fund capital projects, where the school district borrowed the money and it stayed on our books. They're basically saying they'll go back to that system for that little bit. We do have some emergent things. The Vanier boilers were kind of a big issue for us. We were getting into the last few days of August, and we needed to find a way to fix the boilers, because we had just become aware that they would be unusable for that year. So that is one But again, it doesn't really change how they're going to fund it from a ministry perspective. They were just sort of trying to find creative ways to help us at least get through those.
Anyone else? Well, I got a few comments. One, the local capital of $2.1 million. So I guess 1.6 million of that really comes from the sale of Village Park School. So it kind of makes me mad that we sold Village Park School and we have to use the money from the sale of Village Park School to buy computers. I would suggest that there's something wrong with the way we're funding if we have to sell real estate to buy computers. So that's not against you. That's clearly you don't pick the amount of our paycheck that we get every year, but it's frustrating that we're not funded to a level where we could sell a piece of property and then use it to improve something. We have to rely on it to. So that's my comment on that. One other thing, or two other things actually. So I know that we have some potential money coming in from the sale of the property at Vanier. So just wondering, that's been in process for a long time. What's the issue there? Can you say, this might be an in-camera thing, I suppose, but I guess what can you say?
Well, certainly it hasn't been a secret that there was a group that had made an offer and had been accepted on that piece of property. And it is a subdivision of the property, because there is about 88 acres there, and this was for about 21 acres of the property. I think I mentioned this, at the past public meeting, is we're not sort of really experts in subdivision of properties, and we didn't realize that the people that purchased it were sort of in a similar boat as us. So it kind of stretched out through some miscommunication and some issues that came up that we weren't quick to resolve. But I don't think it's a huge problem then that we've kind of taken the process back to ourselves, and our director of capital planning and projects does have some experience in this, and we've actually taken this project back to ourselves, and we'll finish off that part before we try and complete the sale. I'm thinking we'll make progress over the next 3 months, and I do expect that one to close.
That'd be great. If you need any assistance from us to urge the city of Courtenay, we'd be, I think, probably happy to do that. Another piece that I'm wondering about with respect to this information is when do we find out where in the district's priority things are, like the upgrade to a gym at Airport, or an HVAC at Brooklyn, or upgrades to Lake Trail School? Those are substantial costs, so where...
I'm sorry, are you saying is that the normal process would have been through AFG, and we would have bring that up with projects prioritized, and for board information, as the board hasn't in the past really done a lot of, and had a lot of involvement in the actual project determination at the AFG, or are you referring to something else?
No, it's just, it's kind of out there that, the gym at Airport was going to be refurbished or whatever, and I've been here for 4 years now, and I've never seen where that's sort of shown up on the list. So just clarification, when people ask me, how come you're not fixing the gym at Airport, what do I say about that?
Well, I think, and that's where I think when we get into discussions about the use of restricted capital and AFG, certainly would look for board, some board direction. But I think with particularly that one, Airport, we've known for quite a while that the gym is actually undersized. There was a plan at one point to actually try and do that, but there were some glitches in using AFG. In fact, you're not allowed to. So then they had to fall to some of the other funding sources, which until we started to sell properties, we didn't have. Right, and as you know, with local capital, we've done what we can to really catch up the lack of computers in the district for the last 5 or 6 years, until about 3 years ago when we actually did start to pump some money into it. And I think after Caution Board 2, it's going to come again, because if we stop and we have slowed down how much we give them, it will come back as well. But I think we're sort of cognizant of those things that we really do need it, and I think once we get a little further into this process, I think we should make some meetings with the board and find out where their desires are.
And so can we leave that to you to tell us when you feel you'd like our input?
Sure, well, I think, as you know, you're facing a decision next month, which will have some profound impacts. And there's still, it may not even be then, but, you have a couple others after that, depending on where the board goes. And I would think, say, probably 3-4 months from now, I'd probably come back to the board and say, okay, it would be nice to go to the ministry with a plan, and at that point, we should have a deep conversation with the board, look at all our different potential funding sources, consider whether we're going to get AFG or not next year, and all those things like that, and then go forward from there from having spoken to the board about this issue.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else? Okay, thanks, Glenn.
So, the third one on my list here, of course, is the audited financial statements. It starts on page 15, and I will go through them fairly slowly. I'm really actually kind of happy. This is the first time that in my memory anyway where the agenda isn't so packed that I've been given like half an hour to do this. So I'm actually going to go through it fairly slowly. I'm going to start at the back and go from the back because all of these schedules tie up to the front. So it's kind of, I was just in my perspective, and actually when the auditors came and watched one time, they were a bit surprised with that, but on the other hand, they also kind of got why they did it, because everything sort of does tie together from your schedules that have the details to the balance sheet at the front that has sort of the high-level stuff. So I will go through it in some detail, and then at the end, I do have kind of what does it all mean. I think there's budget implications in it for our consideration, and I think we need to have some discussion about that. So I'll just start with that. And so on page 53, I believe, of the agenda, and it was just the back of the financial statement, it's scheduled C5. Not a lot to comment on that one. It's the local capital budget is on there. That $2,131,000 would be the only thing I'd really kind of draw your attention to. The middle column right at the bottom. The other part of it is just your investment in capital assets, which is sort of your amortized part of it. If you look on some of the other statements, you'll see the unamortized is a large amount. But the two of them just make up all the assets of the school district that were bought. So not a lot of detail or anything that's really sort of crushing the board to know. C4. Oh, sure.
Sorry, I should have asked, what's your preference? Wait till...
No, please stop, because I think, I'm trying to get this through. There is some deep understanding, so, please feel free to jump in.
So in light of the conversations to come, C5 says with some disposal, the money spent on configuration. So I'm interpreting that correctly, that was the configuration that was done for this year.
Yes.
Or for, the last year. Okay. So if I look at Schedule 5, is that captured under...
Yes. Services, supplies, purchase.
Huh?
Services, so that's 790.
Yeah.
Okay. So, without...
I mean, it's not, it forms a large portion, it's not 100% of it, but yes.
So 790 is configuration and more, or is configuration and there's more expenditure someplace else?
Certainly, there is more. It wasn't all covered there. But it is, again, the 790 did have some other spending, because there was still some leftover spending that was done by the computer department, because this money doesn't disappear at the end of the year, so they've been rolling, so some of it got spent in that fiscal year that ended on June 30th.
So the purpose of my question is, part of what we've attempted to provide in our grade structure paper is a bit of a sticker price.
Yeah.
So one of the questions that I'd like to be able to answer in broad strokes is, after all is said and done, what does the district actually have to use for anything in terms of that would fall into the broad strokes of a configuration change?
Sure.
So I'm assuming you're going to get to that, or close to that.
Close to that. But it's a good point bringing up here. Like, I don't mind sort of jumping into it here. You're right, the local capital could be used, and it was. It was used. And if you remember when I talked to you, when you weren't the trustee at the time, that some of them that were here might remember, I always said when we did the configuration, there was several pots we would go to and try and not sort of wipe out any one. The local capital was one. We use AFG to some degree as well, right? And then, of course, the fallback would always be that the savings from that would then help to pay if we ended up spending more than that, right? So those were the pots of money that we accessed. Of course, restricted capital, you just can't, right? It's just not possible to use for those kind of things.
Do you have any idea how much you spent on, or not you, okay?
Yeah.
How much we spent on configuration from local capital and AFG last year? Those would be one-time only costs, I guess.
$1 million.
$1 million? So it's almost double what it was supposed to cost. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, so C4, and that's the only reason I direct your attention there is it has that $8,088,000 under the second column, Ministry of Education Restricted Capital. And as I mentioned in that previous briefing note about capital reserves, we lowered that by the amounts of those projects that have been previously approved in principle. So just again to show you that's where the figure is and where it comes from. C1 was the next one I was going to comment, which is page 49. And this one, it's pretty straightforward, but it just shows you the different asset groups we have, the sites, buildings, furniture, and equipment. This is across the top line. Vehicles, computer software, and all those kind of things that we purchase. Again, this is both the amortized and unamortized balance of all the capital assets that, again, just short of $100 million. It's interesting, but not perfectly. So I'm going to move on to the section on page 46 through 49, which are your trust funds, which they call special purpose funds. So B1 on page 46 is a summary page. It shows how many of them are Ministry of Ed designated, so basically the ministry says we have to have. The other, it would be all those others that they're not. And the third one on there is school-generated funds. So as you can see, they began the year with a balance of $409,000, brought in $202,086,000, spent $2,190,000 for a balance at the end of the year of $351,000. So that's good. This number still continues to decline, which is what the board in the past has asked them to use up this funds. And I think they've done a good job of doing that. So page 47. Sure.
Could you just, as people put up their hands, can you just field them and then I don't need to worry?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks, Glenn.
Yeah, go ahead.
And when I talk, you said if you have questions, please ask them. The question I wanted to pose here is when it says on page 46, provincial grants, Ministry of Education, when we talk about what's in the block and what's outside the block, and the grants that we have not yet necessarily heard from the Ministry of Education that we believe might come, might not come,
Yeah.
is that, when people at the public are looking at it, is that the line item they could look to, the 1.388 million?
No, that one, if you wait a sec, that's AFG funding, right? And it would normally be about 1.6 plus the little bits of seismic, but this year, of course, it's not, because they shut it off. So that would only be a small portion of it. So page 47, those are the ministry designated ones, the AFG, for which we got a somewhat reduced number, which left us in that deficit position at the end of the 346,870, if my eyes haven't failed me here. So that's under the 207 column annual facilities grant. Special ed equipment is just some money they get to do, to have equipment that's needed for those students at those designated categories. The B3, which is on page 48, is all the other sort of trust funds that the school district has still. There used to be a long list that's down to just the 4 of them now. Bursaries, which is, I always like to compliment the community. They continue to be very supportive of giving bursaries to students. We have the numbers have gone up and down a little bit, but we still maintain a balance of about $731,000, well, $715 at the end. And that's used to earn interest, which then gives more bursaries. So again, a very generous community that we have here, and it does a lot of great things for a lot of students in the district. The deferred leave is pretty straightforward. It's those teachers that by contract are allowed to defer their salary for 4 years and then take the 5th year off for however it works. So that's just money we have to keep in a separate account. Professional development also needs to be separate. It's the money we give the teachers as well as their own money that they put in for professional development. And the social equity, community links funding, I think it's more normally known by. So then again, that's just there. At the end of the year, we did manage to still have $100,000 that then will be available to use this year, which will hopefully make up for the small amount of funding loss that we've had in that particular category as well. So that's the trust funds. So I'll jump to page 32, which is Schedule A 4.2. I'm sorry, it will jump the notes there in the middle, and I'll have to jump back and forth a little. So I will apologize for that, but so the only way I can make sense of all of this. So 4.2 is the operating fund. I find an excellent breakdown. It shows for each category, so that in the categories functions are instruction, which has everything to do with the schools and at the schools. That's function 1. Function 4 is district administration, so that's the board office, the board governance, and educational administration as well. So those 3 categories of that. Operations and maintenance, pretty self-explanatory. We have the management of that, we have the maintenance, and maintenance of grounds separately, and then the utilities. So that's, the breakdown as it goes across. So page 32 is the summary. If you want to look on 31, it does have just the salaries that make up that first column, but I wasn't going to go there. I'll just kind of work with the totals here. As you can see, the instructional budget was over, largely due to the benefits allocated to the staffing component in this area. Sick leave usage was up in the year. And in operation and maintenance, as you can see, they also were over budget. But here, again, we asked them to do a great deal of work around reconfiguring the district. And some of those costs we'd actually hoped to put off to AFG. Of course, we didn't have a balance left to do. So that did not happen. So that one did get left higher than what we would have normally liked to see.
So is that like 750 higher?
765,000 higher.
So is that all attributed to configuration?
No, I wouldn't say all of it. It is, but there were some projects that were more expensive than we figured. Some of it's configuration, but there were just some other projects as well. Mostly around, I would say the one that really did hurt us though was Glacier View and making it usable for the Learning Resource Center and the Alternate program. It turned out to be a much larger project than we'd anticipated.
Was like half of it, 760, half of 765?
No, that's probably 200,000 to 300,000 of it, though.
Okay.
Because it's
And
790
yeah,
minus the 1 million of 210.
yeah. Well, as I said, not all of the local capital was just that, right? So I'd have to, if you want, I can dig out the portions of that.
This isn't local capital, though. This is operating, right?
Yeah, this is what we couldn't put away anywhere else. So this would be sort of a combination of all the other costs that we rolled into the configuration. Okay, so that's all the notes I have on that one. So on page 28 to 33, there's 3 statements. Now, they all refer to revenue and expenditures at some detailed level. But I just, in the notes here, briefing note, I just kind of went through it at a fairly high level, and I'll do that because it does tie the 3 of them together, kind of. Schedule A1 is a number I was sort of shooting because it does really bring forward the information that's on A2 and 3. But if you were interested in the details of revenues and expenditures, it's there for you to look at. So on those 2 statements, there was revenues were up from, now this is from the amended budget, right? And just, I got a caution on the amended budget. We go and actually put a lot of time in it. If you remember in February when I came and said, are we just going to status quo carry on? And that was the decision, was just to carry on. We did do a lot of adjustments to the budget to try and make it perfect. So yeah, I'm going to read from page 16, which is in the briefing note. So it's about, and it does refer to A1, which if you want, you can stay there, but if you want to follow, I'm going to go from page 16. The revenues, as I mentioned, was up $725,000. The interest that was earned on our deposits, that a large amount of money we have in cash in the bank, earned us less than what we'd anticipated by $151,000. Rentals were up a small amount, $40,000. Provincial grants were up $477,000, and other revenues, just the miscellaneous ones, was $356,000. So that's a net up $725,000, but our expenditures were up as well. Teachers were up about $80,000. Principals and vice principals, $173,000, and if you remember, there was a couple of principals were off for a significant portion of the year, which drove that. Support staff was up $220,000, so that's both in the EAs and the other areas as well. That's the whole support. Professional salaries was up $110,000. Substitute again was $256,000 up. Benefits up $643,000. Supplies and services up about $469,000. So that's kind of, at the real high level, the changes, that difference, if you're still looking at Schedule A1, that comes to that $1,228,000 figure in the first column, 2009, which then if you add to that the Pro-D spending of $177,000, which is, again, it just displays as other, but that is the spending from the Pro-D fund, you end up with that $1,404,000. So that's, if you like, the deficit on the year. So that's the annual deficit. Now, and I emphasize the annual portion because I have to clarify that at the beginning of the year we had a $3 million surplus. So when we came into that fiscal year, we actually had that $3 million there. You take this 1.4 away, and you have 1.6 left. So at this particular point in time, our surplus is the 1.6. Now, if you look to the notes, I think it's note 9. I'll just jump to there for a sec, just to show what that looks like. Give it a page number in a sec. 42? Yeah, so page 42. And it talks in note 9 about the operating fund balance at the end of the year. So those, and it's internally restricted, so basically an appropriation by the board. There's still a small amount of school supply accounts of $77,000. Just since Ed is carrying forward a small balance, $179,000, and the district programs, which range across, from some money at the educational admin to some other programs in the district is $220,000. And what I want to highlight is the employee future benefits there. I show as $1.2 million. So that's, of that 1.6, that's sort of some areas we have reserved. And I'll talk a minute about the 1.2, right, which is for the employee future benefits. So I see we're close to it. I'll move just a couple of pages ahead to note 7 as well, which is just a page in front, page 41. And interesting to note with this one, of course, is people will remember I've talked about this in the past, that generally accepted accounting practices force us to actually have the cash on hand for all employee future benefits. At this point in time, there's about $3.9 million of accrued benefit obligation, which then is adjusted by how much the employees have contributed after the measurement date, and the unamortized net actual cost or loss brings us to about 3.6. At some point, this number we have to get up to about $5.5 million. So as you can see, we still have a ways to go, and that, though, is when I speak about in a minute here about it, that's the number we need to get to the reserve, and that has to be like a cash reserve, basically.
So,
Yeah.
the accrued benefit liability, June 30th, that's in brackets. What does that mean?
That's in brackets, or?
Well, I know what brackets usually means,
Yeah,
but
it's not a deficit, no.
but that's
Not
why
so.
it just didn't seem to make sense as a deficit here, so.
I have to concur with you. I find their presentation somewhat problematic. I think you have to break it out into two pieces, which is the top one, which ends with, it starts at $3,948,000 and ends at $3,974,000. So that's the one piece. That's what our actual a liability as March 31, but then they take those numbers and adjust them, right? And then 3.6, why isn't a bracket? I've asked that question before, and I'm not sure I still understand why they show it that way.
But it's not a deficit.
It's not a deficit,
Okay,
no.
thank you.
So, Len, is this the item where the government used to send us $550,000 a year, and they promised to send it to us until 2010 and then changed their mind?
That is correct. This is the amount that was reduced in our funding at the very start of this fiscal year we're talking about. So in, I think it was May or June 2008 was when they actually told us we weren't getting it. So, yeah, that was back to the funding.
I won't say anything mean right now.
No, that's okay. So that's note 7. Note 5, I just mentioned it because you already mentioned it, though. It's the proceeds from Village Park of $1.6 million within restricted capital, right, which gives us that balance that if you look at. Let me find it. Yeah, page 38. It's, again, so half that funding was local capital and half restricted. So this is just showing how that was disposed of. Okay, so at this point, I'll jump back to the statement. So statement 4.2, which is on page 27, which is just cash flows. So this really is just a statement that brings, how our cash flowed through the year. Nothing really sort of drastic on that one. As 4.1, which is page 26, is very similar. There's not really a lot of information. I think it would be of interest in the board on those. Statement 3, though, page 25, sort of a good one. It does talk about the statement of changes in fund balance. So as you can see from the first column, it's $3 million, which I talked about being our balance at the beginning of the year. 1.2, which is the net revenue expense for the year, the Prody spending, the 1.4, so all those things I talked about are displayed there. It does the same for the trust funds and the capital funds as well, and then just shows the total for the whole works of them for us, for all our funds. So statement 2, page 24, is statement of revenue expenses again. It just shows the most significant part of it is that first column under operating, of course, showing again how we get to that expenditures where we spend more than what we actually brought in of the $1.2 million. Special purpose funds, gained a little as the capital ones did. Okay. So statement 1, I'll spend just a little bit of time on this one. I find statements are actually improving over time as the ministry has done. I used to find them terribly confusing myself at times, and I think the auditors did as well, but they're certainly improving each year, and I'm quite happy to say that I think they make a lot more sense than they did in the past. So I'm just going to go through the total column on page 23, statement of financial position. Our actual cash on hand, $21 million. We have some accounts receivable and a small amount of 1,000, and then a larger amounts of about 415. So those would then, of course, be added because they're assets to us as well. We did prepay some expenses, some learning resources, $475,000. So you add that along with the long-term receivables. So we have some receivables that are longer term and out there. So if you take all that, that gives us the asset or the positive side of the balance sheet at $121,900,000. And so the offsets to that, and I like doing this at the upper level because it kind of ties in how the capital is tied into our overall balance sheet as well. We have accounts payable and current liabilities of just $4 million, so that's the 631 and the 3396. Some deferred revenue of $622,000. I suspect that's largely the international program revenues that they get before June, which of course we can't use until the following year. The deferred contribution, so again, you can look at the Ministry of Ed, and the $8 million is the capital reserve, right, and then a little bit with the trust. So you can see how they bring that in there. The note 6 with the $2 million from the trust funds and capital funds as well. The accrued employee future benefits are on here. Again, so that shows up the liability, which is why we have to have that cash up top to cover it. $3.6 million. deferred capital, which is basically your unamortized capital cost, and our amortized ones, and down below that line at 27 million, internally restricted funds, so that's the 1.6 in operating we've been talking about, and the 2.1 in local, makes 3.8, and then the unrestricted amount at 346,000. And that then brings the whole thing into balance. So it's actually kind of a good statement now. So I think from there, kind of, so what does it all mean, right? Like, what's the impact? I think everybody probably is ways over it, kind of, so many numbers to go through, but I'm hoping at least give you a sort of, if you want to look at statements, there's good rationales so that you can understand for what the statements are and what they do. So I'll probably return to Schedule A1 just to start this. Page 29, 28 actually, 28. So if people remember through the budgeting process, we did talk towards the end about a $726,000 deficit. We did, as I mentioned, have some accelerated spending on learning resources and those programs and schools and supplies also were used up here. And we've always known this has been a potential when we try to get schools to spend their surpluses that they've been carrying, and whatever year they do that, that actually impacts our budget. We don't actually budget for them to actually spend their surplus, because we just don't do it that way. So that has a bit of an impact on presentation. So that is, the two of those come to around 400,000. Now those are pretty easy to fix though, because one is I can adjust the budgets for those that accelerated their spending, and two, that the schools don't have that budget again in the following year to spend, so it's okay, it kind of comes out in the line. So that was about 400. The benefit costs, as I mentioned, were up further from the amended budget of about 640,000. And that is sort of what ties all together, that deficit of about 1.4. There are some costs in there that are not one time, but it's not a huge portion of it. So, again, emphasize that we have a surplus at the end of the year of 1.6 million from that 3 million. We did, if you were to look back at the budget that we submitted in June, you'd see we actually planned to spend a little more than what we actually brought in, so that was about 325,000. So you would need to take that from that 1.2 number, though, right?
Net revenue.
Well, if you can note in the note that's about and it has the employee future benefits on it, like it's I think it's note 9. Note 7, page 41.
42?
41? Yeah, 42.
42? Yeah, this
so
one.
when I talk about that 1.2, and here's what I was going to talk about this again for a minute. So, while this is true, we need to reserve this, at some point in the future, until we actually have the liability, which we don't, because actually we don't have that liability until you get into the year. We just know that that's where it's going to go. But until we actually have that liability and need to set it up, it's basically cash that's not used. So that's really good in one way, because it helps us in any year, if we did miss by our target, we can pick it up without actually running that dreaded deficit that the ministry would have some difficulties with. So,
But it wouldn't cover structural deficit. It would cover.
well, it could be, your structural deficit is just annual. It's just about ending up with a deficit completely. Like if we do end up completely in a deficit because of some of these things that might happen, the ministry would, then you have to, go right to it and fix it the next year, right? Which is okay. I'm just saying that it does act as a cushion in the sense that you have that year to react, or longer if you want it, right? You wouldn't necessarily have to right away get to fix that. Like you wouldn't have to jump on it initially. You do have a bit of a
But
cushion.
eventually we need it.
Yeah, eventually you need it. That's the whole point, I guess,
So
at the end.
if we cut into it below the amount that we need to recoup it
things like that in years to come.
And the point I was trying to get to was, yeah, we have to, if we do this, we have to understand that the benefit cost will remain higher in the following years, that's all. But it is a bit of a budgeting exercise in the sense of, it's just how you can do this without, making it more difficult for us, that's all. Yeah, so anyway, the point I was trying to make was the 325 that we have planned, which, I think is still a good sort of forecast at this time, right? So I think I'll start that conversation a bit about where we end up with that 326 deficit. So some of our costs are higher in 08 and 09, and I'm going back to page 18 if anyone wanted to follow along. We did have some higher costs in 08 and 09 than we anticipated. A large portion of the lower one-time costs, as I mentioned, should not repeat in 09 and 10. Again, those summary configuration costs, the AFG issue, early spending, those kind of things. So I think there's not a huge need to jump into doing any particular, adjustment right at this point. We have diminished our reserves. We do need to tighten up our spending in the current year, and looking down the road further, of course, as we continue to face falling enrollment, there's always going to be the need to cut to keep up with that. But anyway, I think with the 326 deficit, I find that that's probably still a reasonable number to expect, as long as we do those things. We also have, of course, a bit of a tempest in provincial funding, because they seem to be very hidden about where they're going with some of their funding cuts, I would say. There's some uncertainty. Some recent examples, one you brought up was the $500,000 we used to get from Hawaii Future Benefits. Those kind of things that they spring on us, the last minute course funding for secondaries, those kind of things that they have not been great about giving us the heads up those things are coming. So I think if we proceed through this year, being cautious, careful, fiscally prudent, we should be able to maintain a good service level for this year, and I think for the following year as well. Again, as long as we strive to control those costs. Again, just in summary, avoid those drastic cuts. This time, I think, most definitely we'll face greater challenges in the years to come. And to this end, the board, and I think very appropriately, asked for a review of our budget process, and we will do that. And the initial meeting I had with the Finance Committee was, I think, very positive about doing some things differently. One of the things that they've talked about is maybe having a smaller committee rather than trying to do these kind of work at a board table like this, but a couple of trustees and a couple of people from each of the employee groups and all our partner groups, and go into some depth around the budget, right, and be able to understand how this all interlocks, because I'm sure this, to most people, feels kind of a bit overwhelming. And I'd hope to break that down to some pieces that people can understand, and also a deeper understanding of what the future may hold for the district as well. So I think that's a positive thing.
Thanks.
Sure, go ahead.
Wondering when if you could maybe explain funding protection briefly as well, because if we are projected to be down X students and we're down fewer, some people might believe, great, we get $6,000 a student times.
Yeah, I was going to get to that. Thank you. So, yeah, that was the next thing on my list. We are in full funding protection, as I mentioned in a briefing note. So it's great in some regards and not so great in others. But it certainly doesn't, as Jordan pointed out, there are instances where you think you might get more money and you're not going to get it, just because of the way that funding protection works. Actually, at the board, I did do a briefing note, just if the board wanted to follow along, if you find it helpful at all, I'll get past that out as well.
We're not accountants, so
I know.
that would
Well,
be
that's
the
why I
first
thought maybe
clue that, yeah.
some written notes might.
Yeah, words are really
I did try and make it work, if you can look, and I'll have that for others later if they're interested at all. So, like I say, the good and the bad thing. The good is that we can predict our funding better than we might normally be able to, although that's still all said with the fact that the province may change things on us. The bad part is we have to follow at least 200 students, and 400 would even be better. which isn't likely given we've only seen 300 in the previous year and maybe somewhere in the 150 to 200 this year, right?
From a funding standpoint.
Yeah.
Well, I could actually. I'm very, sorry. Yeah, I should have been there. I am always talking more funding, yes. But there's an example in there. The teacher staff in 2010 are going to get a raise to 2.5%. So we will need to find that funding somewhere. Like, we have to reduce in some other areas. And I think you can see where if you have this increase there and you don't lose enough students, because I don't think we will lose enough students despite what I might wish, there's going to be a bit of a disconnect. Another example, which I think was shocking to our director of student services, that even if she brought in 10 students with, the designations that usually bring in $30,000, I would have no extra money to give her. If those services were needed, they would have to come from somewhere else in the district. So this is not only this year, but this is from here out, right? If there's any funding protection like this, it's somewhat difficult to get out. Now, that's good and bad, as I said. It's kind of an interesting place to be. And just to tie in the figures, which the board has in front of them, and people might remember from my budget conversations, there's some cost pressures that happen every year. Substitute costs seem to continue to rise. That would be around sick leave usage to some degree. Benefit costs, a couple $100,000 I put down on there. That's probably light. We haven't seen that low of an increase from year to year in a long time, but one that's what I always hope. Teacher increments, I put down a couple $100,000 for that. Now, before, when we weren't in funding protection, if our costs shifted, we were always sort of compared to the rest of the province and the average cost, and you might recover some of that as you went up and down. You won't now. So any time there's a teacher increment from a step 5 to 5.6, that's an extra cost that you're going to have to find. So that's sort of, these ones I bring up are in addition to the fact that we have to find the funding for the raise as well. The steps and increments aren't unique just to the teachers, the principals, the vice principals, and excluded staff have that as well. And I typically talk about a little bit of supplies inflation there. I'm not talking about things like utilities, those kind of things. There's some cost pressures you're just not going to be able to miss. So if you take that total of those last few items I mentioned, that's about $655,000. The 2.5% salary increase would be in the range of about $880,000, $900,000. You can see that if you combine those two, we're in the neighborhood of $1.5 million is where you would have to find somewhere else. Now, again, if you lose 200 students, you would gain back quite a bit of it, but you'd still be fairly short. You'd have, still probably, half of that funding to find somewhere else.
So is full funding protection, is this an optional thing that we can,
That's a good question, yeah.
Because one of, a particularly big concern that jumps out in terms of students with designations who need one-to-one EAs and now may not even be able to get shared, but may not be able to. There is no funding for even shared. So how can they access education?
Clearly you would have to come from somewhere else in the budget to the ministry's mind. Is it optional? No. It's just how the funding formula works. Whether it's not fair. I think if you look at a significant number of school districts that are in this spot, and it isn't the greatest to be, on the other hand, from ministry perspective, they're looking, hey, we're holding your funding equal even though you don't have the students, so make your adjustments. That would be their sort of rebuttal, I guess, to what I'm saying. You'd have to find it somewhere else. This new? Well, it is for us. This is new for us this year. It's the first time it's happened. And I was, just recently with my director of finance, Ron Amos, we really sort of sat down for the first time and sort of tried to project out. And of course, we find it's much easier to project out because it doesn't change. And then then we need to get in these other pieces, which I was just talking about, that came to the 655. It'll actually make it somewhat easier, I think, for people to understand when we go through this budgeting process, because it's actually pretty easy. We can actually now figure out all the pieces, right? Like, if you're looking at teacher increments, we can actually just go through the list and look at it and say, bang, that's the number, that's what it's going to be, right? The steps or the principals will know. The substitute, yeah, we'll probably take a real good guess. And benefits, probably a bit more difficult, to predict, but still we have probably a better sense. And we'll be able to get that figure of what does the next year look like, as well as all the years after that, because this just repeats, right? This is the ongoing problem that you're going to face from here on in. And so one of two things happen. One is that you get out of funding protection by having a rise in the number of students, or two, they change the formula, which has been, of concern to the school districts for the last 4 or 5 years, that this is becoming an unfair allocation method, but to date there hasn't been any sort of indication from the ministry anyway that they'll ever change this. I mean, I'm sure they will. Yeah. Go ahead, Andy.
Oh, I got a couple of questions now.
Sure.
The 2.5% that the government negotiated with the teachers. So from this briefing note, you're telling me they're not funding it at all.
Okay. In practical terms, I say yes. In their eyes, it will happen. There's
Well, they got these funny glasses on, I think, down there.
It could be, but those numbers all still exist on the funding form. I don't know if anyone's ever seen it. There's a page, that they show all the factors in and then run it through. They will up the factors for that. They will throw in the funding for the teachers, right? But the bottom line is it's still not going to get us up above the funding protection number. So while in one hand they'll say, yeah, we added it in, it isn't going to help us.
My second question. Correct me if I'm wrong. At the Finance Committee, I asked the question about reconfiguration costs.
Yeah.
And was led to believe it was in excess of $2 million. And I think I just heard a $1 million figure mentioned here, so.
No, there's as I said, several funding sources, and some of it got left in operating, which was my other point. But again, that larger number, it has some costs in there that, I call them soft costs, because like the 3 days for the teachers for, moving, that kind of thing. So there's some included in that number would be that, right? Which, is that, we have to pay people anyway, right? So is that a fair thing to include or not? I don't know. I mean, that's, board deliberation, whether they want to consider that as part of it or not. I mean, certainly you could do it without giving that extra time as well.
What do teachers usually get paid to move? Say my assignment gets changed from Brooklyn to Airport. How many days do I usually get paid to move?
I'm not sure actually. Yeah, they typically don't. I think
I get nothing.
So
So then that would be entirely attributable to reconfiguration. It's not a normal annual expense.
yeah. And I think it was modeled on what we do with capital projects, because we have started doing that, for I don't know how many years, where if classroom teachers displaced because of capital work in a school, we do move them and pay them, and they usually get a day off later for it.
So I would say that it should be counted.
Sure. Sorry. Yeah.
Can I just run something past you and you tell me where I'm not understanding? So I understand that we have 2.1 in capital funds. Capital funds. And there's some flexibility with how long. There are rules associated with, but there's some flexibility. AFG, we have nothing because we can get it. We have 8.1 in restricted, which is really 5 point something because of the decisions that we have made in terms of program. And there are tight rules around that.
Very tight.
And then we have 1.6 in operational, which I'm assuming there is some discretion. So if I go back to my earlier point, we're asking about the money because we tag money to option A, B, and C. Really, the envelopes that we have to play within, notwithstanding all of the other things we need to consider around the allocation of those dollars, is in the 2.1 and the 1.6 envelope. Did I miss any bucket of money?
You got nothing under the mattress or anything? No.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
So, there's no other questions. I was just looking for a motion to approve the audited financial statements for
Actually,
2009.
do have another question. It is with respect to this full funding protection thing, which, to be honest, I don't really get, but you're telling me it's unfair, and I believe you. Does your association draw that to the attention of the government in some way, or is this something our association should be doing? Or should we be asking to have a conversation with our own MLA, because, you know, while he was a teacher, I'm sure he doesn't understand this. Or maybe he does, but...
Okay, there's two parts to the answer. We do have I think it's called the Accounting Advisory Group or something like that, which there used to be representatives from our association of financial people and maintenance people in the province. They used to meet quite regularly about the funding formula. I do not believe that's happened in the last year. I think that's basically gone by the wayside. They have, as you know, made lots of changes, and we've not been advised. We find out about them at the same time everyone else does. Do we have an effective method of going through there? No. Do I agree that maybe, you know, your political sort of take on it of wanting to talk to someone else, the MLA or something? Would be up to the board, but sure, I think that would be a good idea.
So it wouldn't be me or probably any of us. I'm thinking it'd be probably a meeting with you or something.
Sure, and I'd be happy to do it.
And then why is it suddenly then this year that we went into this funding protection thing?
Yeah, it's significant drops over periods of time play into it, but it was the 300 largely that we dropped so much last year that it took us way down. Now, again, it's sort of bad to fall into it early in, you know, like if you had fallen into this protection before the raises started to happen, like 3 or 4 years ago, you'd be in much worse shape, right? We actually are, it's not bad. I mean, if we could have got one more year before we fell into it, it would have been good. But the fact that we fell into it this year isn't so bad, because in the previous year we had a large increase in the student services area, the special needs area, and there was a couple other items I just can't off the top of my head remember, but it actually was a good year to actually have it happen. If you're going to have it happen. Again, it speaks to, you know, a long-term solution in the funding formula that isn't on the horizon.
So I just have one final thing. With the previous board, it was important to me personally to figure out how much reconfiguration would cost and to put that information out to the public. And I did attempt to do that, and the rest of the board had no interest in fleshing that out more fully. So somehow the past board, we adopted a reconfiguration with a projected cost of $565,000. And it sounds like it's easily between $1.5 and $2 million is what it actually costs the district. So, no comment on that on the past board. What my comment is that I think that with our current plan or the current funding forecast that we have attached to our grade structure report, to me then those are maybe more realistic cost projections that would be associated with the 3 options, and I feel at least, you know, we're putting that information out there to the public for them to comment on. And
if I could, you're absolutely right. When I talk hard costs, I think it's probably closer to 1.3 million, but you know, that's just sort of my view on it. But I have to say, the experience taught us a lot going through it. There were quite a few things, you know, that were unanticipated. The portable issue, of course, that was about $370,000 or $380,000. We had no idea that was coming. We wish we had. We could have reacted sooner. The money part doesn't bother me so much, the fact that it was, you know, we were finding it out as we were trying to move them. As well as the glacier piece was, again, a surprise to make the LRC fit in there. It was hugely expensive. So yeah, was it more? Absolutely. But I think, as you say, it speaks to us being able to be better at predicting what the costs are.
well, and for me, it doesn't say anything about the work that you did for the past board. It speaks to the responsibility of a board, and yeah, I feel good about our responsibility here, and that we've asked for all of this information, I guess.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, you have a motion? so that the audited financial statements as of June 30th be accepted as presented and forwarded to the Ministry of Education. It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? And that is carried. Thank you. Thanks, Len, for your patience in explaining that to us. Where are we at? Retirements and resignations?
Alan Erickson, Travis Person, and Brown Truckman will retire effective September 30th after 23 years of service in the district. Morning McKenzie, teacher at 40 Allen Street, retired June 30th after 35 years of service in the district. And Jenny McGiffin, educational assistant, elementary resource at Original at the Cult Park retired effective July 31st after 13 years of service in the district. All very long service employees. And then you have two resignations on there. Karen McCumber and Rebecca Farn, two EAs for incidents. So those retirees that this is that have their assembly will be honored as the retirement award.
Thank you very much. We'll proceed
Okay,
with
proceed to the management report first. We'll proceed to the management report.
Have a seconder? All those in favor? Opposed? And that is carried. Thank you very much. Mr. White.
Finance
C.
committee.
White.
It wasn't that long ago that we met, September 15th. We did have a discussion over the Sprott Consulting and a couple of minor changes that were suggested that I believe have since been agreed to by Gordon Sprott. Basically, just for some information that I don't know whether it was out there when we did the approval of the contract, was how it was basically decided was the fact that we received 9 proposals. The Finance Committee vetted the 9 proposals, we brought them down to 3, and came forward with the board with the 3 with the final selection for the engaging Sprott Consulting Services for the project. The other issue we were talking about, as Len mentioned before, was the budget process, which we'll be carrying on the discussion with the October Finance Committee. Hopefully a recommendation to the board at the end of the month. We'll proceed to the report.
Any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. Thank you. Where are we at here? Correspondence. Very nice letter from Janine Fusui, past president, Montessori Society. See the motion there? Or the suggested motion?
No, it's received.
Before we make the motion, I'd just like to say thank you to Janine. I know she's not here tonight. She was very instrumental with helping Montessori get off the ground in our community, and she did amazing work with Alan and everybody else that is part of the Montessori program. I just would like to say thank you for it. Motion to acknowledge received.
Second.
Anyone else? Any discussion? Okay, all those in favor? Opposed? And that is carried. Thank you. Letter from the Minister of Education regarding 15-passenger van. What, do we have something before you guys already on this, or?
Madam Chair, we have, last year, there was a set of guidelines from a group organized called USAFE BC, works with risk management. Risk management is the body that ensures boards and protects boards of education. And it has a set of guidelines around the use of 15-passenger van. We circulated that this year, or last year, and this year we've actually taken the wording right on USAFE and put it into the regulations. and that's circulating right now, I suppose. Without feedback on that, we would bring that back to the board for the change in regulation, so that that wording for the safe is right in our policy. I don't know, just if you think that, what that is.
Fran?
A couple things. Were we going to get a management report? I seem to recollect from a board meeting before the summer that that was in the works in terms of the 15-passenger vans. I don't know if anyone else has that recollection.
No.
I do now that you mention it, that there was a talk about bringing something back in the fall around 15 passenger vans.
Because we could look afterwards, but I believe it's in the minutes of those earlier meetings. And also, I do have some comments about the letter from the Ministry of Education. I have 3 particular concerns I think people should be aware of, something to think about. First, I have a concern that the province is delegating responsibility to school boards, which is in direct opposition to the Bathurst coroner's inquest, recommending that provinces set standards and not leave the decisions and responsibility to individual school boards. And I know I differ, with all due respect, with the BC School Trustees Association position that it should be at the school board level. I think, I support the coroner's inquest on that one. Second, the Ministry of Education advice focuses on what I think are pretty simple common sense givens, like appropriate tire pressure, the importance of seat belts, and drivers needing to be mindful of road conditions and speed. And I think it neglects to address in any way that I notice the more important questions like mandatory winter tires, whether these vans should be allowed or not. Third, the Ministry of Education letter attaches a February 2006 document from the Ministry of Finance Risk Management Branch, but fails to attach more recent information, like the reference to the January 2008 tragedy in Bathurst. I've read in the Vancouver Sun that there's apparently the previous Minister of Education, Shirley Bond, called for an apparent review into the use of the 15-passenger van. There's no reference to that request. I don't know if that review actually occurred or not. And most importantly, I think the failure to even refer to the coroner's inquest recommendations is serious, and whether they agree with them or not, and whether individual school boards will choose to accept or reject the recommendation, I think it would only be responsible to have a look at those. So I think this is an issue that needs to be looked at seriously, and we happen to be in the process of doing that as we've received this letter. But I think the public needs to be aware that this is an issue that they may want to explore on their own. The Vancouver Sun regularly reports updates as to what's happening across the country in different provinces.
What kind of strikes me on this is maybe this is something that our board should draft a motion to the annual general meeting for the School Trustees Association and have it debated there and see if they would lobby the government on behalf of boards to make it a provincial standard rather than a...
I've understood that they've already taken a position that they like the flexibility that it gives individual boards. But I might be wrong. This was from a comment in the Vancouver Sun. I don't know if it's correct.
That would be in the absence of an annual general meeting. They might have discussed it at provincial council, but it might be something we could do.
Provincial council, that was not till in October.
Yeah, I don't recall that being discussed in October. I was there as an observer. I don't recall that. We could, or you could do that, and we could send it in.
Or maybe I could just correct that with the Vancouver, happen to have an excerpt from a Vancouver Sun article where the president supports the ministry's stance on the vans. what was, quoting, "What we were hoping for was flexibility at the district level to determine appropriate use of vehicles," he said in an interview. So it was support in an interview, but not by formal motion. So, and this is controversial in terms of balancing the costs and the possible elimination of programs, as opposed to using the vans. But because safety's so paramount, I think it warrants a closer look.
So where do you want to go with this?
I don't know what other people think. I may be the only one with this opinion.
So, I think I'm wondering if it should dovetail with the forgotten but now remembered piece of work that management was going to do, and then give us that gives us a springboard to the conversation. We have the option to go in multiple directions. We can go to the Executive Association, we can respond to this ourselves, or we manage it. So, I don't want your material you're used to be lost. I'm wondering if they can be sort of more to take into consideration and work at.
Maybe the first step would be the management report, and then we may wish to incorporate some of that into a response to the minister, or not.
So that doesn't need a motion.
No, I'm just wondering, maybe for us, what exactly would you write in the report? Because it isn't on our action list. I do recall making a comment in the spring on what we would like us to bring forward. And maybe even as a refresher about where this has been in the last year for people, or the last 18 months, especially highlighted by the Bathurst tragedy. There was a provincial outcry around what are we doing with the use of 15-passenger vans. There was I believe, I'm not sure if it's the right term, but an inquiry, a national level inquiry around the use of the van. The Canadian Safety Association has redone the standards for vans. I actually went to look at them, and they wanted $80 to order them, so I passed on that. But they've come out with a set of standards, and I believe they're asking provinces to go their own way. The Minister, Shirley Bond, did ask provincially at least about what is the scope of use around the province. It's extremely varied, and it's deeply embedded in the carrying on of athletic programs around the province. It seemed to me the general feeling around the province was, please let boards manage this at the local level, and make sure you have these steps in the process from the Youth Safe BC, which we did, and then we talked about putting it into policy. So that's where we are now. And we went for a period of time where we said, don't rent the vans for probably 6 weeks. And so that's where we are.
Myself personally, I'd like it to be seen at a board level. Our board, our area that we live in is completely different from Prince George. I'm concerned that if we have a broad scope on this issue, that it could be tying us to a situation where we're killing our sports programs. We rely heavily on these. We don't have buses in our system. A lot of these teams, you're looking at a basketball team that have 8, 9, 10 kids on it, and a coach. You're putting them in a situation where you're putting them into private vehicles, which, is it any safer? We're renting these from companies that I'm sure have high standards and would not rent something that is not to be on the road. Being on the West Coast, we do have unique weather patterns, and yes, once in a blue moon we do have snow. In that regard, that we need to have snow tires on our vehicles. I think our coaches are smart enough to realize the safety issues and cancel tournaments and that when it does look iffy. So I wouldn't want to see it at a provincial level, because our province, there's too many different areas that there's too much vast difference.
So I don't want to overemphasize the risk management piece of it, but given the Bathurst incident, given the media attention, given this letter, given our own conversations, just to satisfy sort of an elementary due diligence that we can defend the fact that we, robustly had a discussion around the item and have come to a conclusion. You're absolutely right. Either way, there are no guarantees. Stop using 15 passenger vans and running Greyhound buses, and something could happen tomorrow than Greyhound buses. But it feels that the conversation today has been incomplete around that, and respecting that you have a perspective and that is at odds, but it comes from a different slant than what I'm hearing for Anne, so it would be useful for, I think, for management to put together a position paper, or here's our approach, and give us some
We could, I feel comfortable we could do that and present it with the draft regulation. I think that some policy can come, so that we give the board some concrete stuff to discuss, and we could do that for the November board meeting. Connected us some time between now and then, and gives time for feedback on information put out there already as well.
How does everyone feel about that?
Need a motion?
Yeah, your motion, refer this piece of correspondence to management with the report back for the November board meeting. I don't know, I can't move anything, so you want to move that? Okay, second? Any discussion on that? Okay, all those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. Okay, thank you. That concludes our regular business, and now we'll entertain questions and inquiries from the public. Jane?
First of all, I'm not attending the class. So we're doing like I just have a couple of questions that are probably interrelated. Or a comment, I guess, would be the first one in light of the upcoming consultations on and I guess because we've had so much it's amazing package of conversation to look at that, I want to stress that I have some concern that there's some discomfort and that discomfort is in the wording that I'm hearing about discussing this, and as I say this with utmost respect, because I'm not a great budgeter and I'm not very good with money, so I understand how difficult it is. But my question is, when I'm hearing words like, and I'm sure you're not the only author of this document, so I'm not putting it on you, but when I hear words like, oh, you could strive to maintain this, and or not knowing exactly what's in the document, how many days it takes, or affordables. We didn't know about affordables as we did, but that is in the upcoming discussions. That's part of the piece we're looking for. Questions that are, the comments are not inspiring my confidence in the budget. And because that is a big piece, the financial end, as much as it does not outweigh the emotional impact and the curricular impact that any choices we look at for in the upcoming years make, the financial impact of what's in here is very, very great. And I'm not confident in the numbers because I'm hearing a vast range of numbers thrown out about the configuration. Like we don't really have a solid number. We don't know what it costs.
question.
Jane, do you have a question?
I just need to say that's my comment, is that I'm not confident in what I hear from the past, so I'm not confident in what I'm seeing in the document for the future. So,
Janie, in fairness, we've never asked Len to prepare a statement as to exactly what the configuration cost us.
And I think that question was asked last year, or before we actually heard it, because we wanted a very clear operational budget. That was my opinion of what we asked for. But the question, I guess, is, now that we've gone through that, we've had a year, what evaluation process we have in place, or what has happened. What is the savings? What are you looking at now to then present in the consultation process in the next month? To say, this is what we thought we spent, this is what we spent, but this is why, hard and soft costs. This is what we think it's going to be for A, B, and C. I would like more concrete information, and I guess that's the biggest thing. But the evaluation process we have in place this last year.
So we weren't going to be presenting what the reconfiguration cost during the consultation process. And we do, Len alluded to it, and there's something on the Finance Committee's report with respect to having a committee constructed to more fully discuss budgets and so forth. That's one thing that we're doing. We're also doing the operational review to take a look at the situation in the district. And
I appreciate that. I guess I'm thinking that when you put a plan in place, like we did a year and a half ago, that you already start thinking about the evaluation so that you can better define where you're going to go in the future. So I was hoping that you already had some of those questions in mind about how you evaluate it. And that's fine. I'm not looking for answers to that,
Okay.
but thank you.
anyone else? Sheila?
I have quite a lot of concern about the financial support here because it really indicates that to me that the district, regardless of configuration and all, is quite a financial crunch. And I'm concerned about expenditures that went down $1 million in the last year. And some of that had to do with configuration, but not a lot. And so I think the district needs, and that's some of the trade and spending looking ahead to the future looking at the surplus, the ongoing surplus of $1.6 million, when I expect, we can cover this year's expenses, but actually, those figures saying they're pretty well committed at $1.2 million. You might borrow from it, but you need to put it back. Basically, the district has no operational level deficit this year, and yet you can expect to run one, regardless of any other configuration. These increases that you're looking at here expect to be deficit, and you know we're not over yet. And so, at our path, we usually with some of this thing like that, we're looking at least $30,000 out of the school's operating budget at a time when the tax has no money to make that up. And that's field trips and tablets and whiteboards and AG activities, and that's spread across the district. So the schools have experienced a cut already. So then, well, for you, the board, I would really hoping that you will use that $2 million of local capital and shift renovation, any kind of capital dollars into it as quickly as possible. The project has been doing that over the years because the schools have been degrading and our academic, programs that the kids are receiving has been cut back because the English project could have shifted somewhere else. I think that we need to consider doing that to, a substantial amount, maybe $500,000 this year, would allow you to put the money back into the school budgets, especially when we have plans. We need the kind of needs that we can't cover field trips that we did cover last year, things like that. So money needs to go into the school budget. So that seems to me to be a bit of a priority, and I hope that you got the message from these statements this morning about that, spending and spending. And I just want to, I'm not making a question actually with your, I hope I'm making a comment that comment should be acceptable as well. Is that...
Well, Sheila, to be clear, our board procedural bylaws don't allow comments, but finish off.
Okay, well, here's there's a question in this moment. Question about why don't you do it? But the thing that really strikes me, and of course I said before my consistent way, the thing that strikes me is, we have this huge, one of the unforeseen benefits when we went to a 4-day week was a reduction in sub-costs. And so I'm just speculating here with a 20% reduction in the cost of substitutes, which is $2.9 million a year, and busing, which is $1.7 million a year. That's $1 million a year. So I'm wondering whether the board might not want to look at asking the school management to at least give them a report on the academic and the financial implications for shifting 30 weeks. Because I think there are many things to do.
That's not an item currently before the board.
No, but it is a question that, why don't you ask them to at least give me enough information to think about making it an item?
That's not something we're considering at this time.
Well, in
Does
a
anyone else have a
financial
question?
In a financial crisis like you are in, why would you not look at it?
Does anyone else have a question at this time? Mark?
The fiscal track tonight, and I was at the fiscal track meeting last night, and of course, grade structure is very much on the minds and in the faces of fiscal parents at the track meeting. And one of the things that came up at the meeting that I need some clarification on is I'm a little confused about the costs that are situated in the report, in particular for the 2 high school options and the 3 high school options, 3 high school, 6 high school option. And I chose as the example to ask a question about the 2 high school option because it was a smaller amount in terms of the total cost, in terms of impact on the financial issues of the district. So the confusion seems to be around in Dr. King's original report. There are costings on the final pages, which I assume that's correct. Perhaps the Secretary Treasurer or Director of Finance did, that are quite specific. And then in the report that was released by the board, there is a cost range. And in the note below, it states that the costs indicated with an asterisk beside them are flexible costs. And it states that the final cost will be determined through public consultation. So I'm a little concerned, first of all, what you mean by flexible. Being an educator in the past and knowing what I know about school district budgets, I don't really understand how teacher staffing, principal and vice principal salaries at any time could be flexible. And furthermore, I don't really understand how the public would be appropriately consulted on those items. So if I could ask for someone to clarify that, please.
Maybe if you take a look at the option number 2 and option number 3, you'll see that there's costs associated there that are flexible with respect to staffing ratios. Should we go to a middle school? Probably you've noticed those are over $300,000 for both of them, and we've listed them as flexible. So the reason they're listed as flexible is there are some program choices to be made. Should we go to a 6 to 8 model or a 7 to 9 model? The schools, of course, they'd be smaller than the existing secondary schools, so it would cost more money to give kids a flexible program and to go back to what we had in the past. So if you wanted to offer shop and a band class and cooking and art and all of those things, it costs more money to run those sorts of things than it would be to just have a plain old 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic program. So what we want to know from the public is if they felt we should go to, say, a 6 to 8 model. Is it simply to take kids out of one building to create space and move them to another and carry on with the 3 R's, or are they expecting, if those kids are moved to that other building, that they're going to get a huge full program for those kids in grades 6 to 8? So they need to know if that's what they're expecting. There's quite a good sized cost associated with it. So that's what we're trying to capture there. And I'm glad that you did ask that question. I hope other people also ask that question of us in the public, so we have an opportunity to highlight that there's some
So just so that I'm clear then, so what you're saying is that if through public discussion around this issue, the public decided that it was okay to reconfigure schools and put kids into 79 or 6A buildings, but don't supply any of the programs that we've heard the public want, then that would be okay. The board would move forward with that and just put those kids together without reinstating historical programs.
Our intention is to perhaps educate the public at the same time as we're asking them for their opinions. I think that sometimes people don't understand what things cost, and that these do, there's some funding implications to these things.
So how, for example, then, are the principal and vice principal salaries flexible costs in this particular model, 7 and 9 model? It states that Cape Lazo would be reopened as a middle school. Currently, that school is not open. It does not have a principal and vice principal. So I don't understand how that could be a flexible cost in this scenario. And again, I think it's getting back to the point back here is having some confidence in the numbers, because given the financial state of the district, when you add up those ongoing costs, and like I said, this is for the option that has less ongoing costs than the 6 to 8 option, it's $718,000 more every single year from now on, let alone the $840,000 one-time cost to convert there. So I'm listening to what our Secretary Treasurer is saying, and I'm trying to make sense of how we could move forward and add that annual cost into our budget and not have to decimate educational services and programs within years.
So this spring, there were a fair number of people that said that they would like to see us go to a 6 to 8 model or return to the 7 to 9 model. I think that we owe it to those people to put that information out there. They didn't clearly have an understanding of what the costs are involved. At that time, we didn't know how much money we would have to spend on various things. So what we've tried to do is give comprehensive information. Tonight, a lot of tonight was to make sure that we had a clear understanding of how much money we've got to spend, so the public knows all of that stuff. And then, hopefully, from an informed perspective, can tell us what they feel we should do.
So based on what the Secretary Treasurer has said here tonight, is the board comfortable putting forward options where we're going to have to look at spending $720,000 plus or more additionally into our budget? Is that feasible? Is that reasonable to even be asking? It's sort of like asking someone who is really at the poverty line, would you like to take a trip to Hawaii? I don't think that it's an option. And I'm not sure that we're doing a good thing to be asking the public for something that really isn't possible.
Everything is possible. There's costs associated with everything. If the public feels that this is a priority for them in the school district, then we would obviously have to look at making cuts somewhere else. It's the way it works. We have a finite amount of money, and so now I'm going to let someone else have an opportunity. Mark, this is...
That would be the follow-up question is, so if you want to do this, the board needs to respond, and the public needs to know this to give proper feedback to the board, is if this is the intent of the board, what will you cut in order to make this happen? Because the money is the money is the money. So that would be the question, and to have good consultation. The public needs for the board to be declarative about where it's going and what the standards are, what the rules of the game are.
As I said last time, when we make cuts, and the last board really clearly left a $725,000 deficit for us to deal with this year, really is what it was, ongoing. We had to figure out what cuts we were going to make. So we made $450,000 worth of cuts. We still have a $325,000 deficit. So that was from the last go-round. So the cuts we made were what made sense right now. I don't know that we can say for 100% certain what would make sense next year. As Lenis described, we have a $325,000 deficit already right now that was caused really partially by the situation we find ourselves in now. We're going to have to make $325,000 worth of cuts probably to balance the budget. We can't continuously go into the red. So it's what makes sense. In that year, what we do and what our hope is that we're going to form a committee to have an ongoing conversation year-long with partner groups about spending priorities for the district, and when we find ourselves in a deficit position, what it is that we should consider cutting. So now I'm going to move on. Marilyn, did you have a question?
Yes, I am wondering, still relating to the issue of the flexible costs associated with the various options that are being presented to the public. The bottom line in the report, and has been reported in the media, is that, for example, the Sioux High School 7-9 model could cost anywhere between $135,000 to $1.5 million. What I'm wondering is if the board would consider adding additional information, either as an addendum to this report or making it available on the website some other way, to describe what either end of that range looks like. Because what I'm hearing now tonight is that if you say no to all the flexible costs, then you can wind up with a middle school that does not run any elective programs, that does not have a principal or a vice principal, that basically you are taking the children that are currently in those grades and you're moving them to another grade. And I'm wondering if you could, in the interest of transparency and in the interest of the desire for the board to speak responsibly and realistically about costs, actually describe for the public what they are getting for those costs.
We could consider that for sure. Maybe that's something that we can talk about, Jordan and maybe Tom and I or something.
And will you elaborate even further tonight as to your understanding of what that would look like? So are you talking about, for example, reopening a plaza, or is there a modification to this plan that isn't articulated in the description provided in the report?
No, it's there. I just want to comment something on having a school with no principals. Certainly, we wouldn't do that, but what we would be considering at a zero cost there would be taking the existing FTEs for principals and redistributing them in the district. So maybe some schools wouldn't have a vice principal anymore.
Okay, can I understand from that the board has had some discussion around how it would fund that principal position, and that discussion entails perhaps reducing the principal allotment in other schools? So, for example, if my children attend Rob Road, does that mean we might wind up with 0.7 a principal, or 0.5 or 0.9 a principal?
These are decisions that staff make on an ongoing basis, really, from year to year, some of these things. One of the pieces of, I can't remember if you were at our budget process meetings earlier this year or not, but one of the, maybe it was Sheila that was there, there was a list of district positions, for example, that came forward, and speech and language path, well, we don't need whatever it was anymore, we're going to cut it by 0.2. That sort of thing. They're making adjustments to some of those positions all the time, and teaching assignments, for example, as declining enrollment occurs, there's fewer teachers in schools. Lake Trail, for example, had a decrease in the number of principal FTEs there because there were fewer children there. It's stuff that happens all the time. So what happens is we tell them, here's how, just like the last board did, here's how much money you got to work with, and let us know how this is going to work for you. If you think you're going to need us to make some cuts somewhere, then please tell us. And that's just exactly what we did this spring. Len told us, you've got $725,000 deficit this year. Here's a bunch of stuff you can consider doing in order to reduce your budget. So there's staffing implications, there's supplies implications. It's all a matter of choices.
I guess that in light of what the Secretary Treasurer has told us tonight about the financial situation for the district, and his explanation now the audit financial statements, I'm wondering if you still stand by the statement that made last week that all of these options are viable. And if you do, please define what you mean by viable.
They are viable. Obviously, there's cuts that need to be made to fund some things. And we won't know what to do until we consult with the public. We can't make a decision to stay with what we're doing right now without asking the full public for their input, and we can't make a decision to change what we're going to do. We need to consult the public, and they need a full set of information. We believe that we've given that to them, and we really hope a lot of people come out and tell us what they think.
Well, I think some members of the public are saying that if the cost is only $135,000 to return to K-9 or K-2, at 6, 7 to 9 middle schools, then they think that that is money well spent. I think it's incumbent upon the board to explain what they could expect to get from
$35,000. Yeah, I think that's a fair comment.
That is clear at all in the city.
It's a fair comment. We could talk about that. Does anyone else have a question? Shannon?
Well, I'm just a little bit puzzled. You're talking about the deficit of the last reconfiguration that our district did. But I was under an understanding there was an actual full plan in place, and that plan unfortunately just wasn't able to be completed. There was a plan for the sale of King Plaza. Money had been allocated. That didn't continue. That wasn't able to be followed through. Now I want to know what this board has to bring to the table in order to come up with that additional funding. You're saying that, we've got a possibility of going through reconfiguration. What's the whole plan? Where's all the money going to come from other than making cuts? Anything that you can present that is another solution? Is there any more sales that we could be looking at?
Well, for starters, you'd probably have to ask the majority of people who voted in favor of the last configuration change why they didn't have final board meetings and complete on their plan. I don't know. We had a board meeting scheduled for the end of November after the election, and they chose to cancel the meeting. So they could have completed on their plan. They would have been legitimate, but they didn't. I don't know. I wasn't privy to the reasons why that didn't go ahead. So I can't really speak to why they didn't complete on their plan. With respect to what we're doing now, Lena's outlined for us where we have some money, local capital, restricted capital, what we have in surplus in our operating capital at this point. It's pretty clear what we've got. If we're going to have additional ongoing costs every year to make a change, clearly we need to make some cuts to fund that. Yeah. Sheila, you need to run next time. You really do.
You just need to be open to considering an idea. You might dismiss it later, but you consider it in certain circumstances.
The usual way that the board would consider business, and I would recommend you, since you're a DPAC executive, is to bring that forward to DPAC and see if it gets any traction and forward it to us.
But when you hear something, don't follow up on it.
So we have 2 minutes left in our board meeting. Does anyone have one last question? Ellie?
One is, the first one is about full funding cuts. I think PACs have seen significant cuts in their grants that they apply for. I know that the board has actually set aside some funding to PACs and PPAC that you put forward to each school from the board. I think there's 2,500 to PPAC, and then there's a certain fixed amount plus a per student amount. Is that going to be something, I'm not trying to push it as well, I'm just thinking, is that something that is still going to exist, or can we go back to PAC saying, you know, the board is going to have to cut here as well because they're cutting everywhere? Or is that something that should be put in a letter and sent to the board? It's just because we're having, and everybody's bringing it up.
Yeah, we haven't had any discussions about making any changes to it. I don't know.
I know that not a lot of PACs knew about it, so we presented it last year and it's now. You're just like, here it is now, let's take it away through.
Schools are in difficult positions. I was at the Highland PAC last night, and they talked about how the vending machine sales in the past have been $18,000 per year, and they relied on that for their sports teams and whatnot. And since the government moved us to healthy eating in schools, they said that their vending machine sales were $750 last year. So I imagine the Chevron station up the street, they benefited by that quite a lot.
I had a great discussion with John about that exact thing. The second question I have, just thinking quickly, with regard to Sheila's idea about a 4-day week, you were saying it's not currently at the board discussions. So what is the process then with an idea like that? Do we put it in a letter and submit it to the board? And what is the realistic expectation if we have a submission? When do we see this at least be on an agenda? Like, is there a time frame? Are we...
The usual thing. It would come to, it's a week in advance of the board agenda. We have our agenda setting meeting. It would come forward to that, and it would go on the next board agenda. So
submissions a week beforehand are on the agenda.
Yeah. So you could put that in, and then it would be on the next agenda, and then we would have a discussion about
So
that.
any letter that came to you with a week's submission notice would be on the agenda?
Right at this time, any letters that we're receiving that are with respect to our consultation on grade structure, they're going to be posted straight to the website. They're not all going to come on our agenda. So, yeah, if there is something that you send to us of that nature, make sure it's here a week in advance, and Debbie Page should have a copy. She'll date stamp it for you, and we can put that on our agenda. Have we missed something you've sent? No, have we missed something you've sent? Or?
Not necessarily that I've sent. I'm just curious as to some things that didn't appear on the agenda.
Okay, so it is 9.
Madam Chair.
It is 9 o'clock. So does anyone want to make a motion to extend the meeting this evening? Okay, then take a motion to adjourn then. We have a seconder. All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried.